For at least the last, I'd say, decade and a half or so, I've been asking this question about, what motivates research on discrimination and its impact on health. And I think for some of us here, we're going to kind of go down memory lane, but for those who are unaware about the racial health inequities, I think this actually would be a good primer for why we're doing research on discrimination and inflammation. So when we look into really what has been persistent for the last few decades is the black-white gap in different health outcomes. Black Americans have the highest mortality rate, especially when we compare this to white Americans in the United States. When we look into chronic disease burden, there's a wide range of different diseases that Black Americans suffer burden from heart disease, prostate cancer, respiratory disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, kidney disease, and the list goes on and on. And not to our surprise that because of this chronic disease burden, Black Americans live about 5 years shorter lives compared to white Americans. And there's been a paper that have come out, I would say, about 6 or 7 years ago where the gap was still relatively the same, that basically say if you were to actually hold the age or life expectancy of white Americans constant, it'll take about 30 years for Black Americans to catch up. In the 1990s, there have been many researchers who implicated socioeconomic status as contributing to this black-white racial gap. And this is because when we look into the socioeconomic strata, Black Americans are overrepresented at the lower end of this. And this is when it comes to education, income, and occupation/employment status. Education being one of the biggest predictors of life expectancy is no surprise, especially in the 80s and 90s, why many of these researchers implicated education, income, and occupation as being basically the biggest explainer of the racial health gap. But it was quickly disproven, this is work by Paula Braveman, that basically showed that if we actually were to break down the socioeconomic strata into gradients, at every gradient of the socioeconomic strata, Black Americans live shorter lives compared to their white counterparts. And it was also, but what was striking here is just that Black Americans with a high school degree still lived, with a college degree, Black Americans with a college degree still live shorter lives compared to white Americans with a high school education. There has been a lot of improvements since then when it comes to life expectancy, but still there's a huge gap both in the intersection of sex and race. And so the question here remains, what are the drivers of racial health inequities? And I'm largely driven by the claim by David Williams and Nancy Krieger and others who basically say that structural racism that basically creates a culture of racism and in turn filters into different patterns of behaviors where there's in-group favoritism and out-group differentiation, in other words, discrimination, is a contributing factor to racial health gap. And the way I kind of view discrimination is really these day-to-day indignities that devalues a person's self-worth based on their membership of a given group. And that leads to negative self-belief that's internalized, but also there's a feeling of social exclusion. And here, when we actually apply it, we take a step back and apply it from an evolutionary psychological perspective. Social exclusion, or at least the feeling of social exclusion, really activates a physiological response that really prioritizes short-term survival at the expense of long-term well-being. So in other words, that this really operates, this particular this type of stressor operates like any other type of stressor, that it activates physiological systems and in turn leads to dysregulation and disease. We could break down discrimination into two particular categories. One is everyday discrimination. These are basically day-to-day indignities that tend to be kind of subtle in nature, being treated with less respect, being treated with less courtesy. And you could also break this down into more acute forms of discrimination. These are basically major forms of events that are analogous to, say, for example, being involved in a car accident. And some of the examples of major forms of discrimination is like being denied a promotion, being stopped by police officers, so on and so forth. And there's actually been an abundance of research, especially in the 90s, early 2000s, basically showing the wide range when it comes to the effects of discrimination on health outcomes. So for example, when it comes to physical and mental health, discrimination has been associated with cardiovascular disease risk, all-cause mortality, this is work done by Lisa Barnes, psychological distress, and anxiety. There's also been some, there's very little research in this area, so for those who actually want to build a career in this particular space, very, very few research on discrimination and behavioral responses in terms of how people actually cope with exposure to discrimination. And here there actually has been some work done by Dana Johnson showing that people who report experiencing discrimination tend to have a shorter sleep duration, poor sleep quality. And some interesting work that has come out is looking at Black men who report discrimination. They're more likely to use complementary and alternative medicine. And this is what the researchers actually are suggesting, is that because they experience discrimination, this leads to medical mistrust, which in turn leads to them actually using akin, complementary alternative medicine. And I would say in the more recent years, a decade and a half or so, there has been a greater attention to the biological pathways. If we're making the claim that discrimination operates like any other stressor, we would then see that discrimination will actually activate physiological systems and in turn increase the risk of disease. And this is what we actually are finding, that discrimination, for example, is associated with flatter diurnal cortisol level, which is basically a risk factor for disease. There's also some of the work that being done in my research group is actually showing that exposure to discrimination is associated with obesity risk in terms of weight gain 2 or 3 years later. I'll also show you, this is a bit of a shameless plug, some of the work that we've done that goes a little bit beyond here, which is there's a really cool data set, underused I would say, and I still think it has a lot of potential. It's a 1995 Detroit area study. It's such a good data, mainly because these researchers, led by James Jackson and others, throwing in a bunch of different ways that we could actually capture discrimination exposure. And one way that they actually captured discrimination was basically asking participants, these are Black participants living in Detroit, asking them, when was the first time you ever remember experiencing discrimination? Racial discrimination, to be specific. And those who actually remembered experiencing discrimination in early childhood, between the ages of 3 and 6, had more metabolic syndrome indicators in adulthood compared to those who remember experiencing discrimination in early childhood, basically between the ages of 6 and 9, adolescence, and early adulthood. So quite impactful in terms of these sensitive periods, in terms of exposure to discrimination, and later health outcomes in adulthood. We also then looked into, among Puerto Ricans, this is actually using the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study, where we actually found that those who were ascribed darker skin by the interviewer tended to actually report more major forms of discrimination. This is basically being denied a promotion at work, being stopped by a police officer, being denied a home loan. And this in turn was associated with multi-system physiological dysregulation, also known as allostatic. What was interesting about this particular paper that we found was that objective forms of skin tone, using basically a spectrometer actually just to capture the gradient of your skin tone, was not a good predictor of discrimination exposure and in turn physiological dysregulation, but rather the interviewer rating the person's skin tone was a really good predictor of discrimination exposure and health outcome. We also did another study, because one thing that we read consistently in the literature was that perhaps this experience of discrimination is basically happening in one's head. And I said, well, we can actually test this. Let's actually use polygenic scores of anxiety. Because then if for whatever reason, this actually may contribute to genetic pleiotropy. Basically, the genes will make you perceive the world as threatening, and in turn, the same gene will actually give you high levels of anxiety. And what we're actually capturing when we're actually seeing the association between discrimination and anxiety is really driven by genetic predisposition. And what we found was that that is not the case. In fact, once we adjust for genetic liability of anxiety, exposure to discrimination is still associated with anxiety. This might not seem like a big deal, but it truly discounts the argument that has been made about, oh, experiences of discrimination is all happening in your head. What we also found, we kind of went down this polygenic score road for a little while, that genes might also potentially increase your susceptibility to experiencing discrimination, particularly if you have genetic liability or genetic risk score of obesity. You're more likely to experience or report discrimination, a wide range of different forms of discrimination, and that in turn may increase your risk of obesity later on. And then just more recently, I'll kind of give you a glimpse of what we're actually finding among twins. So one thing that we found, this is among twins between the ages of 9 and 11 years old, were that both identical twins and fraternal twins, monozygotic, dizygotic twins, that they report different experiences of discrimination. Not just this, that already astounded me, right? Like they have two different lived experiences, two identical twins. But what was interesting about this was that their health outcome 1 year later were completely different. And this was largely due to exposure to discrimination. So the twin that reported, again, identical twin that reported experiencing discrimination had higher BMI compared to the twin that did not report discrimination. What was also interesting about this is that we also saw a between twin effect. So even among twins, pair twins that reported discrimination compared to twins that did not report discrimination, the twins that did had higher BMI 1 year later compared to the twins that did not. So what we're also capturing here is that there is other stressors that might be co-occurring with discrimination that we're still not yet to capture with this particular data. So this is actually a ABCD study data. If you're interested in this, we're, again, have a more than merrier mentality, so I'm happy to collaborate with them. So actually, to go back, so there has always been an interest to me about inflammation, because I'll show you the next slide, but I always had this idea, especially when I took Bio 101, that inflammation was actually good for you. And I ran with this for quite some time until I started to encounter actually work by Jacob, work by Bridget Gooseby, work by Tanae Lewis that basically showing that discrimination is associated with inflammation. And I'm like, what is going on here? And mainly because why I was also driven by this is because BMI is a precursor to inflammation. And so what is actually occurring here with regards to this outcome, and what are some of the long-term implications of inflammation? So I'll show you. So again, back when I took Bio 101, we actually showed, I thought that inflammation was good for you, and it actually is good. It tends to actually be quite powerful. And if you're wondering what this is my horrible attempt at animation. So this is basically a monocyte, and they typically tend to be kind of like these like sentinel cells, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in just a little bit. But they're quite good. They keep you alive. They're basically sentinel cells, basically floating around your bloodstream. They're trying to pick out foreign agents to basically get rid of them. And typically, they're short-term in nature, right? Once they find the foreign agent, they basically get rid of them. And the healing process begins with the actual inflammation, inflammatory cytokines and CRP. They tend to be high grade, tends to be basically rushing in to address the particular issue, might be even a cut, for example. And they're quite salubrious, right? There's healing into this, there's tissue repair, and they try to kind of remove whatever the trigger was. And it's not, this particular aspect of acute inflammation happens across the life course. We see no difference here with regards to this. In public health, in sociology, in psychology, when we now think about inflammation, we think about more of the one on the right, this systemic, low-grade, chronic form of inflammation that leads to dysfunction and damage. It tends to be long-term. It tends to be low-grade, so like basically subclinical levels, but just enough to actually cause damage. And there's a lot of damage that's being done to your tissues and organs. And what we're also finding is that this chronic form of inflammation tends to actually be age-related. So basically, the older you get, the higher your inflammation levels actually are. One of the interesting things about monocytes and many other of these white blood cells is that they tend to be quite sensitive to experiences of discrimination or any form of threat. So if you actually perceive an actual threat or even uncertainty, I dare to say, it actually leads to an abundance of monocytes and other type of white blood cells. But what's also interesting then, once you have high levels of inflammation, it could actually contribute to you perceiving the world as threatening. There's actually some really good experimental studies actually showing that high levels of inflammation tends to actually change your perception of even ambiguous events. You actually begin to actually perceive it quite threatening. So is there a relationship between discrimination and inflammation? I mentioned some of these like pivotal research that has been done on discrimination and inflammation, but what's the landscape here? So, and place it within context here, because one thing that we're finding, again, I mentioned how chronic inflammation is basically an age-related disease or marker of disease, finding that this is not equally distributed by race and across the life course. And we actually begin to see high levels of inflammation for non-Hispanic Black people early in the life course, beginning around the age of 15, continuing on across different age groups. So I did what any young person would do here and just conducted a review that ended up turning into a scoping review. And I just want to ask the question in terms of like, is there compelling evidence that discrimination is associated with inflammation? And what we find is that yes, in fact, it almost seems to be, in a way, almost kind of like a stepwise association here, where those who actually report more everyday discrimination, this is a study done by Tanea Lewis among Black women, those who report everyday discrimination, again, these are like day-to-day indignities and disrespect that they have reported associated with high CRP levels. This is work done by Elliot Friedman showing that men, this is specifically white men, who reported experiencing major forms of discrimination. Again, this is like being denied a bank loan, being denied a promotion, is associated with another marker of inflammation, ECY. And then Ron Simons then said, like, what's the effect here across the life course? And one clever study that they did was ask participants, did they experience discrimination in childhood? And those that said that they did, and also have reported more adult discrimination, or in other words, discrimination in adulthood, that was associated with higher inflammation burden. So this is a composite score of different inflammatory markers, IL-6, CRP, IL-10, IL-8. There's some longitudinal work. This is by Edith Chen and her team, finding that particularly for boys of color who report discrimination at time one, about 3 or 4 years later, they had higher inflammation captured in different ways, either by inflammation burden, composite score, or even by monocytes, which I'll talk about in just a second. So what do we know so far about discrimination and inflammation based on this review? Is just that there's an abundance of cross-sectional studies that consistently show a positive association between discrimination and inflammation. And CRP and IL-6 have been basically the two markers of interest, and I'll explain why that might be the case. It's not that they simply are good predictors of disease, they are, but there's a wide range of different inflammatory markers like TNF alpha that also is a good predictor of Alzheimer's. I think that has a lot to do, I'll give you a precursor now, that has a lot to do with like some of the data sets that we're actually using. There's limited but supportive longitudinal evidence, and this actually is critical because one thing I mentioned earlier was that inflammation can actually affect how you perceive the world. And so longitudinal could at least try to smooth out some of this potential limitation. This is the one that surprised me, I would say, the most from our review. It's just that there is no evidence of a vulnerability hypothesis. The vulnerability hypothesis basically suggests that the effects of discrimination is going to be stronger for racially minoritized groups compared to white adults. And what we find is actually quite the opposite, that white adults might actually be more vulnerable to experiences of discrimination compared to racially minoritized groups. And I think this has a lot to do with that racially minoritized groups have developed the coping mechanisms to deal with discrimination compared to white adults that have not. And that actually may be contributing to some of the patterns that we tend to see here. So where do we go from here? And I'll show you some of the research that we're currently doing. One is a need for a life course perspective, increasing generalizability and applying intersectional approach. Thinking about the differential exposure hypothesis, which is something I'll explain in a second, moving beyond CRP IL-6 and then moving beyond current measures of discrimination. So one thing that we noticed in our review was that the vast majority of research has focused on middle age and late adulthood. I think there's two reasons for this. One is because we tend to actually see that this is an age-related biological marker, people tend to focus on this at-risk population, middle age and older adult. I think it also has to do with that MIDAS and Health and Retirement Study are publicly available, and this actually provides a great opportunity to actually test many of our hypotheses. And I think this is why there is an unequal distribution of attention towards these two life course stages, and not enough on earlier life course. So we received an R1. I don't know how long that R1 is going to last, but let's say, for example, it lasts for a while, and just enough for us to actually test all of our hypotheses. But we're looking at early adulthood, middle age adulthood, and older adulthood. We're using AdHealth that tends to capture those between the ages of 25 and 30, at least in wave 4. Middle age adulthood, I'm guilty of using MIDAS and HRS, don't kill me for this. And we wanted to actually ask the question about, is discrimination associated with inflammation using a longitudinal design? So at least we could help address two aspects of what's missing in the literature. This is what they actually have in common. And one thing that you might be wondering is that, well, AdHealth only has this one item of discrimination. How often are you treated with less courtesy or respect than others? Whereas MIDAS has the full 9-item scale of the everyday discrimination. And then the HRS has an adaptive version. This is basically a shortened version, but they include one about experiencing unfair treatment in the healthcare system. What's interesting about this single item is actually a really good predictor of health. It's actually just as good as using the full 9-item. And so for those who are thinking about collecting data in the future, and you're basically tight with space and want to include the discrimination scale, this single item is actually a really good predictor of different health outcomes, being treated with less respect or courtesy. So what we ended up doing is just focusing on that one item and focusing on CRP as our marker, adjusting for age, race, sex, education, and BMI. Just to give you a little bit of the sociodemographics, one thing that's important here is basically average age. So AdHealth, on average, were about 28 years old. MIDAS 51, and then HRS about 66 years old. The distribution of race was lacking. We could talk a little bit about the limitations specifically about MIDAS here. But one thing that we actually found, this is basically preliminary results here, is that those who reported being treated with less respect, not just in time 1, but also in time 2. So this is what we term as consistent exposure. So those who reported, again, experiencing unfair treatment in time 1 and time 2 had higher CRP levels, but only for AdHealth, the younger cohort. And so what we're suggesting, and by the way, BMI is this, once you adjust for BMI, it saps all the effects away of discrimination in the literature. We adjusted for BMI and the association remained. And this is actually quite powerful because I think what's happening here is that there's a cohort effect. That for those who are early in the life course, early adults, who experience discrimination, they might be at risk of having higher inflammation in the future. This is about 8 years later. And so another important aspect here that we found was that it actually confirmed the vulnerability hypothesis in that white young adults who report discrimination tend to actually have higher CRP levels in the future. We did not find this for in mitis nor in HRS. What we also did was look at another hypothesis called the differential exposure hypothesis. This hypothesis posits that because racially minoritized groups report more discrimination, does this help explain inflammation disparities? And so we use this econometric tool called the Oaxaca blinder decomposition method. And we looked into socioeconomic status like education, income, occupation, and then also different discrimination exposure. And what we found was that lifetime forms of discrimination, this, in other words, this is like major forms of discrimination, denied bank loans, stopped by police officers, so on and so forth, explained about 18% of the racial differences in inflammation. And surprisingly, everyday discrimination didn't explain the racial differences in inflammation, nor did workplace discrimination. Education, which I still highlight here, is still an important factor in reducing inflammation. And I feel like we shouldn't lose sight on of the more traditional social determinants of health and health disparities. But this is to say that if people, this is specifically between Black and white adults, if they actually had the same level of education, if they both attained a college degree, it would help reduce racial differences in inflammation by about 17%, close to it. And the same thing goes with lifetime discrimination. If they experience the same level of discrimination, you could even presume that if Black adults did not experience the same level of discrimination as they do, but would be comparable to white adults, it will help kind of reduce the inflammation differences by 18%. We also proposed in this review that we actually need to look into this intersectional approach. What we actually have been finding is that discrimination, the vulnerability hypothesis actually may operate quite differently. When we look into sex differences or differences based on socioeconomic status, that the burden actually differs. One thing that we have been finding in the literature overall was that Black men tend to actually report more discrimination compared to Black women. This is with the everyday discrimination scale. But when it comes to the effects of discrimination on health, we tend to find that it's much stronger for Black women compared to Black men. There's a couple of reasons why I think why Black men tend to report more discrimination. I think this is a limitation of the measure. So those who are interested in developing new measures, I really do believe this is a critical area of actually developing a measure that is much more tailored to the experiences of Black women, given that the everyday discrimination scale was developed by a Black man and based on his own experiences. So there's a big gap here. But what's interesting is that the effects tend to be much stronger for Black women. We also tend to see this with socioeconomic status as well, that the effects of discrimination for Black adults with higher education tend to actually have higher CRP levels. One thing that we're doing to contribute to this literature is by looking at racial differences within the Hispanic population. One thing that we actually found, perhaps don't want to spend too much time here, is just that when we look into the life expectancy within the Hispanic population, Black Hispanic tend to live shorter lives compared to their white counterparts. And in fact, if you look into the Hispanic Black men or Afro-Latino men, they tend to actually live shorter lives compared to any group on this slide, even compared to non-Hispanic Black men and non-Hispanic and Hispanic Black women. We ended up going into the literature, it's basically scraping the literature to see if has there been any studies looking at race and skin tone differences in the Hispanic health world. We only found 22 studies. It just blew my mind. Given the racial diversity within the Hispanic population, it's an egregious finding that just that alone. But one thing that we ended up finding was that across different indicators of health, the health outcomes of Afro-Latinos or Black Hispanic compared to white Hispanic mirrors that of non-Hispanic Black and white Americans. So one way that we're beginning to kind of address not only this gap, but also contribute to the discrimination information world is by working with a large group of researchers. I don't know if I told you, but I'm an academic baby, and it takes a village to raise me. And these are basically people who are raising me to become a pretty good researcher here. And one thing that we're looking at eventually, we're currently collecting pilot data in Washington Heights, which is a predominantly Dominican neighborhood in New York City. We're looking at different aspects of racialization, both aspects in terms of like how they racially identify, particularly Dominicans who are living there. This is a really tricky aspect of data collection because of internalized racism. Hispanic do not identify as Black, or at least the majority of them do not. If you were to ask a group of Hispanic, 100 of them, about 2% of them will say, yes, they racially identify as Black. But if you were to actually then say, do you identify as Afro-Latinx, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Colombian, Afro fill in the blank, 25% of them would actually say that they identify as such. So this is a limitation of the current binary structure of racial identification, that one actually needs unique ways to kind of capture racialization in the Hispanic community. And so one thing that we're looking at is ascribed race as one, Afro-Latinx identity, as well as ascribed and self-reported skin tone. And whether these aspects are associated with different information. This is actually another animation of information, so please bear with me. And then we're then looking to see what explains these potential differences. Are there potential mediators here that begins to kind of give us a sense as to why racial differences persist in the Hispanic population? Neighborhood disadvantage is a really important aspect here. Black Hispanics are much more socially isolated compared to any other Hispanic subgroup in the United States, across different states. And despite actually having higher levels of education, this is actually using the last time I think we'll be able to do this is actually using the 2020 census data. Despite having higher levels of education, they tend to actually have high unemployment rate compared to their white counterparts, as well as lower income compared to their white counterparts. And this largely, I believe, is driven through discrimination across the board. There also, what we're going to be looking at is like almost kind of like NIH Love, 3 aims. So this is the trifecta here. So we're going to be looking at protective factors to see what mitigates the impact of racialization on inflammation. Okay, so then we also propose moving beyond, in this review, moving beyond CRP and IL-6. I think these are fantastic markers. I think they really help provide the foundation for where we should go. It basically is almost kind of like smoke, and we should just follow that smoke. There's something interesting in this particular area. even if there's non-significant findings, I think like you could still pursue it. But I think there's another framework that we could actually see this to actually move beyond CRP and IL-6. It's actually using the concept of transcriptional response to adversity. The last time I'll say it is I'll say CTRA for now. And basically what this suggests in the social genomics world, it kind of helps clarify the link between any type of adversity like discrimination and inflammation. Basically says that if you experience a type of adversity that activates the threat processing aspect of your brain, particularly the central nervous system, it then in turn activates the sympathetic nervous system. And this then tends to actually release a wide range of different hormones, and that in turn begins to actually modulate different genes through transcription factors. And there's a particular pattern that they've been finding both in mice studies, primates, and in human studies. There's a pattern where there's a certain set of pro-inflammatory genes that are expressed and a certain set of antiviral genes that are suppressed. And this is what's called, this particular pattern is called CTRA. And one thing that, and this actually was developed by Steve Cole, who's a wonderful person that will respond to your email in like within 24 hours. The pressure's on him. And one thing that he has found is that those who report experiencing heterosexism or homophobia had higher levels of pro-inflammatory genes expressed. One thing that we've been finding in the literature is just that there are racial differences in gene expression levels, that racially minoritized groups or group members tend to actually have high levels of pro-inflammatory genes compared to their white counterparts. And another study found that those who report discrimination, basically discrimination explained about 50% of those racial differences in gene expression levels. This paper just came out. I found this really interesting, that people who, particularly Black patients who experienced traumatic brain injury, had high levels of pro-inflammatory genes, but only those who actually reported lifetime experiences of discrimination. They're the only ones who basically were at risk of having high levels of pro-inflammatory genes expressed. We did this in mitis, looking at discrimination and inflammation levels, and what we're actually finding is that for racially minoritized males, the association was much stronger for them when it comes to discrimination and pro-inflammatory gene levels compared to white males. So there's something here in looking at even molecular precursors of inflammation that could give us a better insight into the connection of discrimination and inflammation. You may have noticed that as I was kind of describing this particular model, that I did not mention anything about monocyte development. And I think this is a really cool area to begin to explore even further. Because one thing that Steve Cole and others have basically proposed was that when there is this genetic signaling that occurs, it actually leads to an abundance of monocytes. There's monocyte production and mobilization, and then that in turn actually leads to high levels of inflammation. And there's only been basically 2 studies looking at discrimination and monocyte abundance. One actually was done by Edith Chen from the slide I previously showed, and another one done with the Jackson Heart study. And they actually didn't find an association there. But one of the good things about, I would say, about monocyte is that these are one of the more interesting type of white blood cells. We have about 2 to 5% of these white blood cells basically floating in our bloodstream, and they're sentinel cells. And actually, they're really cool because, like, once they actually find a particular foreign agent or cut, they actually turn into like macrophages to begin actually repairing the cut or addressing the foreign agent, whatever that might be. But they're also very, very sensitive to social experiences. And so both in primate and human studies, what we have found is just that people who are at the lower end of the hierarchy or the socioeconomic strata tend to actually have high levels of monocyte abundance. But we know very little, again, of discrimination in monocyte counts. And so what we ended up doing is just leveraging health and retirement study data to look into this particular white blood cell. There's a lot here in terms of like the method, the data collection that I won't get into, but it's quite fascinating, publicly available with the flow cytometry code book. And we wanted to also not only look into discrimination, but the type of monocyte count. There's classical monocyte that are much more closely associated with how much inflammation levels is going to occur. And then also there's these non-classical counts that are more involved in the repair of any damage to your bloodstream. We actually used the full adapted version that Health and Retirement Study provides. And we basically standardized by 4 standard deviations. This is actually just to show the stream effect of like experiencing low discrimination compared to high levels of discrimination. 4 standard deviations above the mean for high, 4 standard deviations below the mean for low. And we used, as they recommend, a weighted linear regression model, a tiered approach, and I'm only going to show you the 2 models, the unadjusted and then the fully adjusted one that's adjusted for BMI, smoking, and alcohol consumption. So this is the sample that we're working with. I'll just draw your attention to just the average age, 68 years old on average, equally distributed when it comes to sex identification. And about, this is predominantly white samples, so about 8% of those of participants identify as Black, 7% as Hispanic, and then 3% as other. And what we actually are finding is that just that general form of discrimination was associated with about 9% increase in monocyte counts. Well, it's also promising, but we still have to kind of like refine a little bit of our results here, is just that this actually may be operating through the abundance of classical monocyte counts. So if you look into the unadjusted model, greater discrimination was associated with greater classical monocyte. But once we adjust again for BMI, smoking, alcohol consumption, it's attenuated quite a bit. You might be wondering, like, what the heck is this particular model, since you basically propose classical and non-classical as exploratory. We also wanted to see whether discrimination exposure leads to basically an abundance of or an increase in other leukocyte or other white blood cell counts, such as lymphocytes, natural killer cells. And what we're actually finding is that once we adjust for, again, BMI, smoking, alcohol consumption, that a lot of that effect goes away. And so what we're proposing is that monocyte might actually be one of the pathways that actually perhaps begins to align with this CHRA model, that once people experience discrimination and there's a genetic signaling happening, that it actually increases the number of monocytes, and that in turn leads to an increase in inflammation. But this is just the beginning. I think we'll then look into the long-term implications of whether these people with high monocyte counts in turn have high levels of inflammation. Modeling will be tricky, but I'll defer to many of these brilliant sociologists to help find a way to refine these models quite a bit. But again, I do think this is the beginning. Future longitudinal designs are definitely needed. We're looking at other immune cell types as well right now. What we're finding is that my colleague Jamar Bather, who's a biostatistician at NYU, finding that discrimination is associated with higher dendritic cell counts as well. So this is another potential pathway that discrimination might increase inflammation. Okay, so I'm just going to burn right through this because I'm really good at highlighting problems and never offer any solutions in terms of like where do we go from here. And I think we perhaps could actually move beyond current measures of everyday discrimination and major discrimination, both developed by David Williams. I do think it still has a lot to give. There's still a lot of life in those measures, and I still feel like it could provide a great foundation for understanding the impact of discrimination on health. But one thing that I proposed with a great colleague, Courtney Bowen, is that we can actually just also think about clever ways to kind of capture the experiences of marginalized group members, and one of which is attributional ambiguity. So I remember back in grad school reading a work by Brenda Major and Wendy Mendez, where they find, and they actually, through experimental studies, show that marginalized group members tend to experience this aspect called attributional ambiguity. It's this idea that when you see a negative event, you have no idea whether that event is discrimination or not. And what they're proposing is that this particular experience can actually be a stressor. And since then, I've been pitching it to different researchers, and it's like, oh, there's actually no way you can actually capture this particular experience in a survey. And I'm like, well, you know, like I took a shot of whiskey and then I'd be like, oh, let me try. And so then I basically asked a question. This is through an online survey. I asked participants, I said, in the last 6 months, have you ever experienced a negative event where you had a very difficult time determining whether it was discrimination or not? What we found was basically 3 things. One was that racially minoritized groups, non-Hispanic Black, Hispanic Latinos, and non-Hispanic other, and multiracial, reported experiencing attributional ambiguity. That was one. Attributional ambiguity was also associated with psychological distress. And what helped explain this was that we asked a follow-up question in terms of like, how often do you ruminate about this experience? And those who ruminated frequently basically had higher psychological distress. So I think we now developed a full scale. Tanae Lewis is including it actually in one of her R1 studies, looking at the full scale of attributional ambiguity and see whether above and beyond experiences of discrimination, is this particular exposure associated with information. We also think about wealth, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, that when we think about the egregiousness of the racial wealth gap, is oftentimes ignored, I would say, in the public health literature, even though there has been oftentimes mentioned how wealth is a social determinant of health and health inequity. Again, Tanae and Lewis have brought this and have shown that wealth is a huge determinant of health. Sorry. And one thing that we did, we basically used that as the foundation to look into this in the health and retirement study. And I should also mention why this is critically important. I think this has more implications for policies, and mainly because if this is not addressed, the racial wealth gap will continue to increase. If you look at just Boston, Massachusetts, right, one of the most liberal cities, put this in quotes, liberal cities in the United States, the net worth of a white family is about $254,000. The net worth of a black family is $8. And there's going to be, there's still $8 left for them to actually hit basically rock bottom. There's a moment where we actually begin to reverse this by effective intervention, but only if we actually show that there's actually compelling data and evidence to actually show the impact of wealth on health. One thing that we're actually finding here is that wealth is associated with allostatic load, again, multi-system physiological dysregulation, above and beyond income, education, occupation, and even discrimination exposure. It also explained about 15% of the racial gap in allostatic load as well. So I think there's a lot of promise here in terms of not only looking at just wealth, but also the impact of debt on people's health and its contribution to racial health disparities. And then lastly, I would say, it might sound like I'm contradicting myself a little bit, because policy is important. I think there's a lot there that could be done now more than ever. And there's also, but I've noticed, especially in the social psychological world, that there's been an overemphasis in mindfulness meditation as a way to kind of reduce the impact of discrimination on health. But what we argued in this paper was that the burden falls heavily on victims of discrimination to basically deal with the exposure to unfair treatment. And one thing that we propose is that for those exact same social psychologists that kind of go back to the 1970s, where Henry Tajfel and John Turner says, that one way that we actually reduce discrimination is by actually creating or developing intergroup contact interventions. And basically, the premise of this is that in workplace and in school settings where a racially minoritized child and a white child are working together, and they both have knowledge and both are experts in a particular project, it actually helps reduce prejudice and discrimination, particularly for the white child or the white adult. The evidence actually is quite mixed for the racially minoritized person, given that their stress level still remains high. But there's a promise here in terms of how we actually begin to refine these interventions to, again, reduce the burden for victims of discrimination and really put the onus on systems and perpetrators. So with that, I'll thank my funders while they last, and I will open it up for questions.
Our normal procedure is first 2 questions go to we're running out of time, so if you have burning questions, there you go. Julia.
Hi, that was a really great talk. Thank you so much. I'm only 5 foot, so I'm standing. I just was curious if you could talk more. I have a little bit of background I was a clinical laboratory specialist when I was in the Army, and we talk a lot about I looked at a lot of blood samples, so WBC counts, complete blood counts, and you talked about monocytes a lot, and that kind of got me thinking, I'm really curious how you all measured that or looked at or if that's what you did, because there's like phases that white blood cells go through, and that's how you see like that chronic inflammation, or if it's an acute, we would see it a lot in patients with, what would they come back from? I can't remember. They would come back from Korea with the parasite, and because they wouldn't take their medications properly, because no one in the Army listens. We're all really hard-headed. But so I'm really curious how you all measured that and how you use that in the science, because it's really fascinating to me because it's a really simple blood draw.
Yeah, so we didn't measure it. So this is secondary data from the health and retirement study. And there's more information that I could probably convey right now in terms of like the actual data collection. But you're on point here, which is probably why we need multiple measures of the VBCs, because anything could actually trigger the abundance of specifically monocyte. I mentioned, like how it's very, very sensitive to any type of exposure. But I'm talking about like social exposure, but you're also talking about even just more aspects of like infectious disease that actually affect monocyte levels. So I think like multiple ways to kind of capture this across time would actually help validate what we're finding. It's a great question, and I'm happy to provide you that link with how the data will actually work.
Thank you.
Question?
Hi, great talk. I also had a question about the monocytes and about like timing. And I was curious what you thought about like how social exposures are affecting monocytes versus like CRP and IL-6. Do you think these changes you are seeing are occurring at the same time, earlier in the life course?
Yeah, I mean that's the premise, right? But one thing that I mentioned earlier was that it's still plausible that monocyte count could also kind of shape reports of experiences as well. One thing that we're kind of like pitching is just that is the current exposure to discrimination that is leading to higher monocyte count, given that they're so sensitive to current social experiences, that these experiences actually leads to an abundance of these specific white blood cells. But this doesn't necessarily disregards or precludes that what's happening early in the life course can actually lead to greater increase in monocyte or even like higher levels of inflammation. And I wish that there was like a better way to kind of capture life course exposure to then really kind of like account for this in the relationship between this information.
All right, Beckel, you're going to have to email him. But please join me in thanking Adolfo for